Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to another Colorado Sun political event. The Colorado legislature just wrapped up its 120-day lawmaking term on Monday. It was tense and intense as Democrats flexed their muscles after their big wins in November, expanding their majorities in the House and Senate. And a lot passed, a lot failed, and a lot happened in between. We have a great panel here for you this evening to break it all down for you, including Governor Jared Polis, who I'm going to introduce here in a second. But before we get to the event, a few housekeeping items. I just want to say again, as we always kick off these events, thank you so much to our Colorado Sun members who make all of these events possible. We truly couldn't do this work covering the legislature or, interviewing lawmakers, the governor without you. If you're not already a Colorado Sun member, please consider joining today. It's really quick and easy, coloradosun.com/join. It makes a big difference. It allows us to pay attention to what's going on at the legislature and communities across the state. We work so hard to try and kind of keep the pulse of Colorado, keep our finger on the pulse of Colorado and bring it to you. If you're a politics nerd like me, you should join as a premium member so you can get the unaffiliated newsletter, our twice weekly newsletter pulling back the curtain on Colorado politics and policy. I know the governor's office reads it, certainly our congressional delegation, lawmakers, lobbyists. If you really want to get the full inside scoop, please sign up as a premium member. And thank you so much again to the sponsor of tonight's event, Aponte and Busam Public Affairs Consultants. We really appreciate their support for all of our events like this and our mission. And finally, before we get into everything, if you have questions for our panelists during the event, some people submitted them beforehand, you can send them to questions@coloradosun.com. They'll be sent right to me and I can see them and try and relay them to our panelists. I can't get to everything. We've already gotten a bunch of questions, but I'll do my best to combine and so not surprisingly, some folks had very similar questions to the ones I was planning on. So on to tonight's event. Our first panelist is Governor Jared Polis. He doesn't really need an introduction, but for those of you who may not know who he is, he's the leader of our state, a Democrat, first elected in 2018 and then reelected in November to his second four-year term. This was his fifth legislative session as governor. Thank you so much, Governor, again for joining us this evening. We always appreciate hearing from you. And I'll give you kind of a broad question to start off. There's been so much talk about this legislation maybe not being as productive as some folks wish. Particularly progressives didn't feel like it was the best for them. This was your fifth lawmaking term as governor. I wonder how you kind of rate it, how you address to that criticism, and maybe some of the highlights of the things that you felt like you got done this year.
Yeah, so the question I posed in my State of the State is, who do we want to be as a state, as a people, when we're 150 years old? We're approaching our sesquicentenary, 2026. That's just 3 more years. How do we want to honor who we have been and prepare for the next 150 years to be even better for the state of Colorado? So people put their trust in us to tackle the big issues, to plan for the future. There's a lot of things we could go into. I'll just talk about a couple of the ones that I'm most proud of that we worked on. In the realm of education and workforce, obviously, free preschools just starting this fall. Thank you to the voters. And by the way, there's a ballot initiative to keep the overage on the nicotine tax. I hope people vote for that this November. It'll allow for more preschool hours. But on top of that, this session, we did a couple things. One is, we are sadly not different than the national trend of math achievement having gone down during the pandemic. So we're still above average nationally, but the whole nation went down during the pandemic. And so what we did is we created funding for after-school math tutoring programs to help kids get back ahead in math. Pardon the sneeze. Allergies season is getting tough here. And we also are the first in the nation to do this, as far as we can tell. The graduating class of 2024, every member of that class will get a $1,500 scholarship. Now, we're not the first to give a scholarship to a graduating class, but the traditional word scholarship, you can use it for. If you go to CSU or CU or Mines or CMU, absolutely $1,500. But this particular funding is a lot more flexible. Graduating seniors next year can use it to apply towards apprenticeships, work study, skills academies like a 9-week coding academy, all the different ways that in today's world and tomorrow's world, people of all ages, but in this case, graduating 18 and 19-year-olds, can prepare for success, many times with a better ROI than a traditional 2 or 4 year degree. So we're very excited about that. And I know it's going to unlock a lot of opportunities for our graduating kids. One more in workforce. We had great success last year with a new program that made it free to get a certificate in community college in many healthcare related fields. Because at the end of the pandemic, we had so many openings because so many people burned out. So we made it free in our community college system to become an EMT, phlebotomist, nurse assistant, pharmacy technician. And sure enough, enrollment increased about 20 to 30%. This year, what we did is we looked at other key areas that we have workforce gaps in our state. We looked at them all, the whole economic sector, and there's shortages everywhere, but it's particularly acute: firefighting, law enforcement, construction, early childhood education. And we expanded the free certificate program for community college to these fields as well, to help make sure we fill workforce shortages, empower people with the skills they need to earn a good living. One other area I want to talk, and this is all future oriented. That's why we're talking about 150th, who we want to be, helping people live up to their potential. The other area I want to talk about is energy. This might have seemed like a quiet session on energy. That's not a bad thing. People weren't worked up. We were working on the same thing, but we did some pretty big things. Going forward, we'll no longer have a Colorado Oil and Gas Commission. Their new name will be the Energy and Carbon Management Commission. Why? Because they're going to still do all the work they do for oil and gas, but they have the expertise in permitting underground activities in a very expedited way. Some argue too expedited, but that's what they do well. And so they will also be the place in the state where we do a comprehensive underground activity. So geothermal. You're going to drill for geothermal. Looks a lot like drilling for oil and gas. Permitting through what was known as the COGCC, that will now be known as the Energy and Carbon Management Commission. We got the enabling legislation we needed for the hydrogen economy. Colorado is competing with 3 other states, New Mexico, Utah, Wyoming, to be a hydrogen hub under the Federal Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, $800 million of potential investment. We had to prepare for the hydrogen economy. We got the bill through to do that. So hydrogen, geothermal, carbon sequestration underground. These are the building blocks of the reliable, clean energy that is Colorado's future. I ran on the goal of 100% renewable energy for the grid by 2040. We cannot get there without the exciting and promising technology around hydrogen, geothermal, and sequestration. And we got a lot of those building blocks in place this legislative session.
So I guess just to kind of cap this off, I mean, it feels like you kind of disagree with the idea that not much was done this session, and it maybe if 1 to 5, 5 being the most in terms of what was done, 1 being the least, how would you rank this in terms of your 5 sessions?
Let me give you 2 more examples. I'm happy to rank it how you want, but let me give 2. I signed healthcare bills today, saving people money in healthcare, core goal of ours. 2 of them made things that we did stronger and more workable. So we did Colorado option, right? Was it 2 years ago now or last year? Great fanfare, very exciting. This year, we rather quietly made it substantially stronger and more effective in delivering savings to people who buy insurance in our state. Second, even more exciting, we were one of the first states to do this, PDAB. Again, pharmaceutical board, it sounds boring. This allows Colorado to negotiate for prescription drug rates. The version that had been passed in prior sessions sunsetted before it could be effective. It limited the number of prescription drugs we could negotiate. We vastly expanded that capability this session. So, I mean, you tell me, was it a bigger deal just to get the word pharmaceutical negotiation or Colorado option, or was it a bigger deal, which is what we did this session, of giving those policies some teeth, along with another bill I signed today around community benefit transparency for nonprofit hospitals that are making billions of dollars. So these are big deals. They may not be as flashy as the first time around, but they actually give real teeth to a lot of the work to save people money on healthcare.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I did talk to some lawmakers who felt like this was a session of implementation, like finishing, full-day preschool, behavioral health administration funding. A lot of those things got done, and they weren't maybe as sexy as some of those big-ticket items with the banners that I remember, but certainly big. So I know during your State of the State speech, you kind of talked about housing a ton. This was kind of declared the session of housing. It wasn't something that you mentioned in your intro and kind of the bills that you highlighted. And obviously the thing that sucked up a lot of oxygen at the Capitol this year was the land use bill that you kind of heralded as the long-term way to solve the affordable housing crisis in Colorado. Measure was pared back almost immediately when it was heard in the legislature, ultimately failed Monday night in the Senate, kind of in an 11th hour breakdown of negotiations or inability to move forward. I wonder what you chalk that up to. This was a really ambitious piece of legislation, and something that you talked about so much. I feel like from the start of the session, what happened? Was there not enough stakeholding on the front end? Why did this not make it through?
Well, first of all, I think you said it was weakened in the process. Just to be clear, it was also strengthened in the process. The House put a lot more back in it. So yes, it was initially weakened and then it was strengthened, as often happens, legislative process. This is a big problem our state faces, and I think what I'm trying to do as governor is help this happen a few years before it would happen on its own. Washington State average home price in Seattle $850,000. They, Republicans and Democrats, were able to pass similar policies, allowing duplexes and quadplexes and single family zoned across the state. But it took getting to 850,000. Montana passed a similar bill this legislative session as well. They've experienced a huge run up in housing prices. We're at about 600,000 in the average home price in the Denver metro. So I guess the question is, does it have to get worse before we demand action? And what does worse mean? It means less affordable. Or is there a course that we can take now? And I obviously, like as somebody who likes to look around the corner, likes to say, hey, this is becoming a detriment to our economy. It's a typical example of government overreach, of an artificial scarcity that's created just by government regulations, almost entirely. Left to its own in a free market, the housing market, keeps up with the demand, and you look at the replacement cost of a house and some margin for somebody, and we probably have homes that were 200 or 300,000 in the Denver metro area. We don't. The average is 600,000. Why? Because of artificial scarcity created by a systemic issue we have in our state that prevents the free market from operating. So we took solutions from Common Sense Institute, Cato Institute, others that Republicans and Democrats had implemented in other states. And I don't think it's so much a question of if Colorado will do it. I think they will. But the question is, they could do it in 8 years if we don't push this now and prevent a lot of pain from happening from a lot of people who can't afford to live here if we don't solve this sooner rather than later.
I guess just to drill down though, what happened? I mean, there was so much pressure from your office on the lawmakers who were on these committees, and I've never this was felt different. There were so many bills that you.
Well, I don't think it was. I think it was pressure from the people of our state. I mean, I ran on a platform of housing and I won by almost 20 points, right? 19.6 points, but who's counting? Many legislators ran on this platform and they sponsored these bills. They fought for them. I guess there were others that didn't run on or didn't care about housing or were beholden to special interests and government regulations on the local side that they wanted to just regulate the state out of existence. And I get that, but I think we've got to loosen the regulations and allow homes to be built to keep up with the market demand. I mean, it's just common sense, and it just gets worse until it gets better, Jesse. There's no other solution than removing the artificial constraints on supply. And that's why that's the path that a number of other states have taken. And I hope my goal, as I articulated in the State of the State, is I really care a lot about Colorado. I don't want us to become like California. There are cities in California with $1 million home prices. We have an opportunity to avoid that fate here, but we need to be bold, and we need to do that. And I was proud to see a relatively strong bill pass the House by a strong margin. It didn't have everything in it that was needed on the middle housing front, but certainly around accessory dwelling units and transit, it absolutely would have moved the bar in housing. A very strong bill, even stronger, came out of the Senate Housing Committee that included middle housing. So, it's just a question of how we get there. And, I can be governor of a state with $1 million homes as the average. It saddens me that we're not a state where people can afford to live, but I'm hoping that we can avoid that and have the foresight to take a better path, because we've seen this play out in a number of states.
And I kind of think you hinted that this will come back. I wonder if you can talk about what form. A lot of our reader questions tonight are kind of asking, will zoning mandates be in there? Will, parking requirements? Will you try again next year? And how will you change
Well, I
from
mean, everything is a cost thing, right? So, what does a parking requirement mean? It usually adds $20,000 to $40,000 to a home. And by the way, I'm all for parking. If you buy a place and you want parking, by all means, buy parking. But we should let the market determine that rather than central planners and politicians, right? So, you shouldn't subvert the market by saying, "Oh, as a politician, I know better, and I think you should have two parking places because you have X square feet." Let supply and demand work that out. So, I mean, again, all these things add cost to housing, and the more regulations we can get rid of, the lower the cost of the housing will be because it'll meet the market demand.
And how about bringing this policy or some version of it next year? Do you think that'll happen?
Well, I think the problem gets worse. I think that there'll be even more desire to tackle housing the less affordable it is. As I said, I think as governor, I try to lead. I could certainly, if you had a governor who sat back and done nothing, we're probably 6 years away from solving this. Hopefully by leaning into it, we do it in a year or two, and build to remove the burdensome regulations that are causing this crisis, and artificially raising home prices beyond what most people can afford.
Okay, and not to drill down too much on it, but just to be fair, if I said that it's coming back next year, would that be a fair statement, or in some
Well, I
form?
think, look, I don't think you've ever seen this diverse and important a coalition wanting change. And what do I mean by that? Businesses, chamber, unions, same side, arm in arm. Environmentalists, housing advocates, arm in arm. So this is, and again, what's driving it all is just the mandate, as somebody who ran for office that I have, to do something about the high cost of housing. So I think politicians feel a need to solve it. I think the business community, workers need a place to live. Businesses need a place for workers to be able to live, to be able to thrive. People are absolutely crying out for solutions, and it'll fall on the state legislature to address this.
All right. And one last question on this bill before we do move on. I wonder when you started this process if you believed that there was enough support in the legislature to move it through, or if you felt like it would build support as things kind of went on, as more hearings happened.
Well, I think everybody who took this on, Stephen Woodrow, Amon Judah, others, knew that it's always a big deal to challenge the status quo. We've been doing things the same way in our state since 1974 for land use, and it worked for a while, but it's also led to where we are today. And we have to figure out the way forward to make sure that we can remove the kind of burdensome regulations and costs that are passed along to homeowners and renters. And I think there's an increasing desire to do that. Again, building on what Montana did, and Washington State and Utah has taken a number of these measures. It's better to do it before there's more pain, and hopefully by leaning into it, Colorado can get it done a few years before it otherwise would do it.
All right, so let's move on to talk about property taxes. Obviously, another housing related initiative that was talked about a lot. You and I have talked about property taxes, I think, for years since the Gallagher Amendment was repealed in 2020 by voters. Why did it take so long to get this bill ready? It was dropped in the last week of session. And can you address, the criticism from counties and special districts, and even some Republicans who say that they weren't involved in the drafting of the policy?
Well, I think the right time to have done it would have been concurrent with repealing Gallagher. It was a mistake to leave. It was correct to repeal Gallagher. I supported that. It made our state less competitive for business. It had a one statewide phone limit for everybody, but it should have been replaced concurrently. Okay, didn't happen. So how do we replace it? It's my understanding, Jesse, that a lot of the math relied on knowing what the assessments were, and just simply put, those weren't mailed out, and we couldn't. Policymakers who had to write policy and math couldn't do that before those were sent out. So I mean, you can't really. What's important in anything fiscal is math, and you can't do math without the input numbers. So I think that's why it took so long.
I mean, certainly the assessment rates came out about a week before the bill. It was a very complex piece of legislation, so those talks must have been happening throughout the legislative term, right? I
Well,
mean,
I think the main talks, Jesse, were really more not that everybody knew we needed to do property tax relief. I think it was more, do we do it for a short period, or do we try to do it for a longer period to replace Gallagher? And A lot of good arguments on both sides. I mean, you could say let's just do it for a year or two and then figure it out. But I think frankly that people of the state want a replacement for Gallagher. They want a way that they can prevent increases in their property taxes. The truth in taxation cap under this measure does that in a very compelling way. And it also helps, I mentioned this in some of the communications, restore some of the injustices of Gallagher. What does that mean? The shifting of the tax burden to our small businesses, making our state less competitive. We are one of the lowest tax states for homeowners. That's wonderful. 49th out of 50. Let's keep it that way. I think truth in taxation will. But we're like 24th highest on commercial property tax. I'm hoping that with the 11% decrease in that rate, will be significantly lower on the business front for taxes, and therefore more competitive as a state going forward.
And I'm hoping you can address too just that criticism from counties and special districts and Republicans that they felt like they were left out of the conversation. Was that intentional, or why weren't they brought into this complex discussion?
Well, everybody can't be part of every conversation. I know that many folks were consulted and listened to in this process. Ultimately, it was the legislature who had to craft sort of the right compromise, and I'm confident that Speaker McCluskey, Senator Fenberg, got a lot of input before finalizing that.
Just one more question on property taxes before we move on. There was some reporting this evening from Complete Colorado, which I know is a conservative news outlet, that there was a mistake in the bill about the name of the ballot measure. And I don't know if you've heard about this or aware of it or what's being done, but they were saying that it should have been Prop II instead of Prop HH, which is not it might be confusing to voters who are reading the stories, but I'm not sure if you're aware of this issue.
I have not been following that. The legislature referred another measure, again, I don't know the letters either, that relates to preschool. The nicotine and vaping tax took in more than the initial ask of voters. So there will also be a lettered ask. Again, I don't know the letters and I don't know which one is which, but there will be an ask around keeping the extra revenue for preschool that also went forward. So I have not seen, I don't know what either of them are called at this point, but you can probably look that up.
Okay. So moving on, kind of tied to the property tax debate, obviously, was this talk of TABOR refunds and how they're going to be distributed for the current fiscal year. These refunds will arrive in folks' mailboxes in April. And I wonder, why it took so long to have this conversation around TABOR refunds. We've known that they were going to happen, and ultimately we decided to do this flat rate mechanism that you guys chose to pursue last year. Obviously, this is tied to Proposition HH, but I wonder why it was waited, that there were discussions that didn't happen until the last 3 days of the session. Lawmakers have said that part of the reason was in negotiations with your office, things didn't pan out until that final term. But what was the delay on this, and why tie these?
Well, I think the two discussions are related. I think the TABOR surplus, just as the last round of property tax relief, part of the TABOR surplus was used to backfill local districts for property tax relief last session. We have $200 million in the budget I signed that is for property tax relief. I think it was always anticipated that anything additional for property tax relief is our surplus dollars that would be used for property tax relief. So the two kind of need to be discussed together. Obviously, the voters will consider them together. They are fiscal matters that are kind of intricately related by the fact that the TABOR surplus goes down when you reduce property taxes.
I remember before the session you had said that you really preferred that money be used for an income tax rate reduction. Was that something that you asked the legislature that didn't happen?
Many times, and I will many times more. And I believe that we should not have a TABOR surplus because we should cut taxes. And that means income taxes, where I've not met a good reception by the Democrats in the legislature, but it also means property taxes, where I've met a better reception from the Democrats in the legislature. So rather than have the government take this money and redistribute it, we should just reduce taxes so that we don't have a TABOR surplus and let that money stay and grow in the private sector where people need it and where they've earned it.
Would that mean if say the legislature, I know there was consideration about a bill making the TABOR refunds flat in perpetuity, if something like that were to land on your desk, would you reject it? I mean, I wonder if
the key to any, I've been very clear about this from day one, and obviously I ran on reducing the income tax. In my mind, the key to any more progressive Tabor refund mechanism is cutting the income tax. And so we've got to do that. The voters have done it twice. I've supported that. And the voters will do it again if the legislature doesn't find a way to temporarily do it. And that's the difference. The legislature, what I advocate, means we do it when we have a surplus. We're not like ratcheting down or locking in a lower revenue. It's only when the money's there. But the voters, and again, I support this because it was the only option we had since the legislature wouldn't act. We permanently reduced it twice. I'm very proud. One of the things I'm most proud of in my governorship is when I came in, the income tax was 4.63%, and now it's 4.4%. Again, we're for any and all additional reductions in the income tax, and we prefer them to be temporary and relate to the surplus. And we'll continue to advocate that policy with the legislature.
And just to give credit where it's due, the rate reduction was because of ballot measures that were pursued by some conservative political nonprofits. And I know you have supported a few of those vocally as they were going through, and there may be another one on the 24 ballot. We will keep track of that as it goes on. So in the time that's left, I want to tackle a few more questions. I want to talk about water. It was something that you've discussed, lawmakers at the Capitol discussed, and then ultimately it became a task force bill. I wonder if you're disappointed in that, and if you could talk about why some of these other options weren't pursued. Colorado Politics talked about buying water rights in the Western Slope. There was talk of a use it or lose it. Ended that program. Why didn't that happen? Why did we?
Well, there's a lot happening on water, and I think you'll hear from Senator Roberts in a moment on some of those. But one of the more urgent items that we needed to do is make sure that our water basins and special districts had the ability to maximize pulling down really unprecedented level of federal funds under Inflation Reduction Act, Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. These are jurisdictions that frequently cannot, because of the way they're set up, put together matching funds on their own. So we made it a priority through the budget process to make sure that our water basins and special districts are able to have the funds they need to match for federal grants that can really have a transformative impact on water in Colorado. Many of them align with our state water plan, some of them in parallel to our state water plan. But I'm very excited about that work, and we'll continue to move forward with water conservation, as well as making sure that we invest in the water projects we need to meet Colorado's future needs.
All right, and in the minute we have left, I kind of want to look forward a little bit. One of the things that's happening this week is the end of Title 42, which is the rule invoked by the Trump administration during the pandemic to limit migration. It's going to be, again, rolled back on Thursday, and I know there's been a lot of migrants coming through Colorado. I wonder, what your administration is doing and working with Denver in order to prepare for that. Is there enough money to respond to this crisis? And how are you going to handle things differently than the first time around where, there was some criticism from the mayors in Chicago and New York for sending these folks along to those cities?
Yeah, so if to the extent that there are, cities that are helping with this humanitarian crisis in Colorado, and I think, to my knowledge right now, that's only Denver. The state is happy to help how we can, and we are supportive of Denver. And what does that mean? It means we're happy to help with logistics. We're happy to, help with the support that they need us to do. There's some financial. We've extended some of our emergency funds to them in the past, and if there's a need again, we'll look at that again. Some of those are reimbursed by the federal government. Some are not. So again, we're very supportive of whatever direction different cities in Colorado choose to take. But for cities that take this on, we're happy to be there helping them. Specifically, we've called on Department of Homeland Security, the Biden administration, really three things. Obviously, one is border security. That should be 1, 2, and 3. Border security, border security, border security. They need to secure the border. Number two is funds. If they want interior states like Colorado to play this role in absorbing refugees, we can do it, but it should be a federal or shared responsibility to give us the resources to do that. And then third, we need temporary protected status or work authorization for Venezuelan and Nicaraguan immigrants. There's a date where they qualify, but if they came after that date, they don't. The refugee process takes 150 to 200 days. We believe that people should have the value of individual responsibility and contribute day one, and many of them want to work day one. So how do we sort of turn a liability into an asset? And we've called on Secretary Mayorkas, the Biden administration, to do another round of TPS, temporary protected status, which pending the refugee claim, provides workplace authorization within a week or two, and that would make a big difference as well.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I know I told you it's 6:30, so I apologize for using 2 minutes extra of your time. But thank you again for joining us. We always appreciate hearing from you on these events, Governor, and we hope to see you at next year's pre-legislative event.
Thank you.
All right. Well, moving on, we're going to introduce our next panelist. We're going to get into the state lawmakers. I'm going to take a sip of water. It's a lot of talking from me. So I want to welcome our next two panelists from the Colorado Senate. We have Senators Dylan Roberts and Barbara Kirkmeyer. Roberts is a Democrat from Avon who's serving in his first year in the Senate after serving in the House. Used to be a local prosecutor and is chair of the Agriculture Committee in the Senate and sits on the Senate Judiciary Committee. And then Barbara Kirkmeyer is a Republican who was elected to the Senate in 2020. She ran for Congress last year but lost to Democrat Yadira Caraveo. Before that, she was a Weld County Commissioner and is currently one of 6 state budget writers on the JBC. Which, if you don't know what the JBC is, you should, because they spend a lot of your money, and sometimes Senator Kirkmeyer is trying to stop that from happening. So we thank you both for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. We'll just jump right in here since we're a few minutes behind. Senator Roberts, I want to start with you. You and I have had these conversations about how you were often in the headlines this year for some of the votes that you took, being a swing vote on the Judiciary and Housing and Local Government Committees, thinking of Senate Bill 190, which would have increased penalties for people who sell drugs that cause a fatal overdose. That one failed, as well as Senate Bill 213, which we talked to the governor about, and I know that you were a pivotal vote in terms of changing that measure. I wonder how you approached both of those pieces of legislation and how you balance kind of the intense pressures of your constituents and people at the Capitol and the caucus. It's been very interesting to kind of watch you be in between all of those rocks and hard places this session.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse, and thanks for having me on. It's good to be with you tonight and with my colleague, Senator Kirkmeyer. So, I was sent to the Capitol to represent my district, and I take that very seriously. And I represent an incredibly diverse, large, geographically diverse, economically diverse, politically diverse district. I have towns that are very liberal and towns that are very conservative, and then most people fall somewhere in between. And so, I take it very seriously that I need to look at every bill, consider how it's going to impact my district, how it will impact the state, and I, make my decisions based off of that. And there are certain bills that come along there where, because of the committees I was assigned to and the committee makeup, that I ended up being the swing vote on a few of those. So it can be a challenge. You have to, when you're in that swing vote position, but if you're going to stay true to your district, you can't let that influence the way that you vote. So that's just the way that it shook out. But I feel like I owe it to my constituents to vote my district first and not my caucus sometimes.
Yeah, and I think the Senate's an interesting switch from the House. I've talked to some members about that, where the House, things, more voting blocks arise. The Senate, I've heard each senator kind of described as being on an island. I wonder how you, and I guess you kind of talked about this a little bit, but I wonder if there's ways that Democrats can maybe work in a more united way in future sessions, and we'll talk a little bit about the vitriol of this particular session. But what is the path forward for Democrats to be able to work on these things and find kind of a unified way forward, as opposed to having all this infighting that we saw?
Well, I think that, to be honest, we had an incredibly productive session, as a Democratic majority and just as a legislature as a whole. A lot of the work we did was bipartisan, and we did some pretty big things this year. So I think there were a few bills that got a lot of attention that didn't make it all the way through. And so there's sort of a perception that a lot of things didn't happen, but that's actually not the case. And so, and we found a lot of common ground within our caucus and with the other side of the aisle on some really important things like education funding and some affordable housing bills and water funding that I'm sure we'll talk about. But, I think moving forward, there are still some big policy priorities that I know my colleagues have. And I think, we have to learn from mistakes that were made this year, perhaps do some better stakeholding, perhaps build a better groundwork for that. And also, there's sometimes you come in with an idea for a policy, but the way it's written on paper doesn't work. And sometimes that's where I get hung up, where, I may support the concept or the overall goal of a bill, but the way it's written on paper is not going to work well for the people of Colorado. So there's always things to learn, and often some of the big bills, that Governor Polis tried on universal pre-K, that didn't get done in its first year, and you learn from those challenges and those conversations, and then sometimes the bill comes back and it is better because of it.
And Senator Kirkmeyer, this was your first year on the JBC. There was five of the JBC members were new. 5 of the 6 JBC members were new, and it was kind of interesting to watch you all work. And I know in previous years you talked a lot or advocated a lot for the end of the budget stabilization factor to buy that down. But and oftentimes I know Democrats are saying, well, what do you want to cut in response? And I wonder if your view of how to balance those kind of important fiscal interests and all the pressures have changed in the process. If you maybe have less interest in buying down the BS factor immediately and more on saving that to go to other priorities, how do you balance all those things, and how did the JBC kind of open your eyes to how that all works?
So previous to being on the Joint Budget Committee and previous to being a state senator, I served on the Weld County Board of Commissioners. And, in my county, I led my county to zero debt. We also reduced our mill levy by 7 mills. And, we were able to get it done. You really just have to prioritize. So your question about education and the budget stabilization factor, and as I say, appropriately named the BS factor, because to me, that is exactly what it is. I found it a bit disappointing that we only got to 180 million of the buy down when we needed to get to 321, and the money is there. And as I stated several times to microphone, we're sitting on $4.6 billion of fund balances and reserves. And that's like $1.2 billion in the state education fund, $2.2 billion in the state reserves. And then there's another $1.2 to $3 billion that is in the permanent trust fund, which again is education funds that come from our state lands. So the money is there to have bought it down. And what I found really frustrating with on the Joint Budget Committee is, as a Republican, I'm fighting to make sure that we uphold the Constitution. And we all take our oath seriously, but the Constitution is very clear that we're supposed to be providing a free public school system for every child in this state. And then the Constitution was also very clear with Amendment 23 on how we should add additional funding to education. And what I found really disappointing this year is that the state lowered their share into the state education fund by 158.5 million, yet the school district share increased by like $644 million. So in the last couple of years, bills have been passed, laws have been passed that actually increased property taxes and increased the mill levy for school districts. So while we're requiring the school districts to bring in more money, we lowered our money, and then we wouldn't buy down totally fully fund education. We wouldn't get rid of the budget stabilization factor. I just find that amazing that we can't do that. Last year when I had a budget amendment to buy it down totally, I was told, well, go find the money. Well, I can find the money. It's in the budget. It's in the state education fund. And that's what we should be using to buy it down, so that school districts know exactly how much money that they're bringing in and what they're going to get per pupil. And we don't have this kind of on the backside, we go through and we say, oh, we think this is what we're going to give you per pupil funding, but then we're going to go fund all these other things in the budget that we apparently must think are more important than education. And then we come back and we make adjustments so that the funding that you thought you were going to get is now going to be less than that, when we're sitting on fund balances of $4.6 billion. Doesn't make sense to me. I know it's there. I know when I first got on the Joint Budget Committee, and this is my first time on this side of the of the Joint Budget Committee. But I served as an executive director of the Department of Local Affairs and worked in the Department of Local Affairs, managing the budget and assisting with the budget presentation. So I know how it is from the state side, from the governor's side, the executive branch, if you will. So it wasn't really all that different being a county commissioner or from being a state executive director, because I felt like I had a pretty good understanding of the budget in the first place. It was just more making sure that I understood what the processes are. But I would say working on the Joint Budget Committee, I really enjoyed that. We had some great discussions. Never was discussion cut off by our chair, who is a Democrat. So there are 4 Democrats, 2 Republicans. Never was our discussion cut off. We had great discussions about how do we make this budget work. What I was concerned about coming into this is looking at the governor's request when he only had a $35 million request to buy down the budget stabilization factor. I mean, way too low in my book, way too low. I was able to get an amendment on in the education committee to raise it up to 180 million, which still isn't the full buy down, but it's better. And we did get an amendment on the bill, the School Finance Act, that says that it will be paid off next year, because again, we should be held accountable and give those school districts what they need. But again, had a great budget committee. Even though 5 members were new to the budget committee, our chair had been on before, Senator Zenzinger from Arvada. She did a great job kind of herding us all together, if you will, but very collegial, very focused on what is in the best interest of the state and how do we get there with ensuring that we don't have a structural deficit, which is one of the things in looking at the governor's request that we were there was this possibility, and we can't have a structural deficit. We have to have a balanced budget. That's a constitutional requirement. So I enjoy being on the Joint Budget Committee. The discussion is a lot more thoughtful, a lot more fulfilling, and again, it was very collegial, and we were able to work through a lot of things on the Joint Budget Committee.
My understanding with the situation with the state land trust or the state education fund was that the reason it wasn't tapped more was concerns about, would that money be there? And I've never understood, and maybe you can just explain briefly for our readers why, that money isn't used to buy down the BS factor. Is it concerns that it wouldn't be a permanent funding source, or what's the holdup there?
Thank you for the question. And I think the concern is that they felt maybe future legislatures couldn't prioritize appropriately. I'm used to going through and you prioritize what you have to fund first. You don't go do it last. So the funds are there. Then there was this discussion about, we might be headed for a recession. So we use the Office of State Planning and Budget's forecast, which is the governor's Office of State Planning and Budget. That's his office. And we use their forecast. And even in their forecast, they said there was about a 40% chance of a recession. But even in their forecast, they're still forecasting that there would be an additional $1 billion coming into the state education fund next year. On top of that, they are forecasting that general fund revenues that came in this year, that they're saying for fiscal year 23-24 would be at about they came in this year was like 16.7 billion. They're saying the next year out, they're going to be over $18 billion. So that doesn't sound like we're having money go away. It just means, really, we should be prioritizing education first. I don't think that should be a problem for people, but apparently it is, because if you prioritize education, you could essentially basically go through the budget and spend almost all of the dollars on things like education, higher education, Medicaid provisions, things in the Department of Healthcare Policy and Finance, Department of Corrections. Those are things as a government that we have to provide for our citizens, and those are things that we should be funding first. So then there's a whole bunch of other bills, which it's kind of crazy to me. I mean, we actually had pots, and they called them the governor's pots of money. That was like 500 million. I mean, it started off at $635 million. And I'm like, what do you mean he just has a pot of money? The budget's not supposed to be a slush fund kind of thing. But we ended up with, I think it was like 431 million, somewhere around there, of governor's pots of money. I mean, at one point it was 499 million. And then there was some shifting around in the budget. And then it was 469 million. And there was 30 million set aside for all the other legislators. And I will tell you the comment I made to the chair of our Joint Budget Committee and a former Joint Budget Committee member who's the majority leader, Senator Moreno and Senator Zenzinger. When we were doing the budget on the floor in the Senate, they kept trying to tell me, you can't vote for any of these. We have to hold firm on the budget. And I looked at him and I said, no, that's not how I work. This is the day that every senator gets their opportunity to put their fingerprints on this budget and say, this is what's important to them. This is what is a priority to them. And we should be listening to that. And if they've got some good ideas, this budget doesn't just belong to the Joint Budget Committee. It belongs to all 100 members of the General Assembly. And if they have some good ideas, I'm going to vote for them.
All right, so moving on for a question for both of you. Water is an issue that affects both of your districts. in big ways. Obviously, Weld County is one of the, I don't know if it is the largest ag producing county in the state, and Senator Roberts, I think the Colorado River headwaters run through your district, and certainly affects recreation and agriculture as well. And Senator Roberts, I'll ask you this question first. You were one of the sponsors of the task force bill that came up this year. The governor and I talked a little bit about that. I wonder, what obviously these folks are tasked with providing recommendations for the legislature to take action in future years. But what are some of the ideas that have been floated around that you think should be pursued in terms of what can be done to reduce water use and address scarcity in Colorado? And then obviously that affects the lower basin states as well.
So I'm thankful that we're talking about water. I think water is the biggest challenge that our state faces over the next few decades for a variety of reasons. Climate change is inducing a decades-long drought, and some people say it's going to be status quo. We're going through an aridification of the West, but it's threatening the Colorado River and its tributaries and the entire basin from Wyoming and Colorado all the way to California and Arizona. What we need to do, I believe, at a state level is continue to be leaders in that basin. We are doing more in Colorado than other states on the Colorado River are, certainly a lot more than California and Arizona. So I think we need to continue that leadership and be aggressive about how we are pursuing our water conservation goals and protecting our agriculture industry and showing our downriver states and the federal government that we're doing our part. The nightmare scenario is that the federal government comes in and says, we are reopening the Colorado River Compact, or we're going to adjust the Colorado River Compact, and Colorado and the upper basin states need to cut their water use significantly because there are just more people and, frankly, more political power in California and Arizona than there are in Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming. And that's true. And so we need to prevent that reality. So things that we want this task force to look at, and I'm thankful that we're going to have this task force. It certainly was not as much as a lot of people wanted. And there were certainly some people that were even against having a task force, but I think it's a good middle ground. They will have tough conversations over the summer and the fall about what are some conservation programs we can emphasize and put in place in Colorado. What are some ways we can support agriculture and help farmers and ranchers with efficiency in their water use? And then what does it look like to have a state program of temporary reduction of water that compensates people for their losses, allows it to be as voluntary as possible, and ensures that it's temporary? Because the alternative scenario of the permanent acquisition of ag water rights is not, I think, a road that Colorado wants to go down. And certainly I don't think ag producers in my district or anywhere in Colorado want to go down that road, but it could be a reality if we don't continue our leadership on this. So I'm eager to follow the task force. They'll have up to 12 meetings over the course of the interim, make recommendations back to the legislature by the end of December. And then, we can pursue things and hopefully work with the administration, work with the ag industry, work with water providers from across the state to get this right. Too important not to get it right. And that's why I think the task force is an appropriate step forward. It's a small step, but it's a careful step. I also just, this session, thanks in part to the Joint Budget Committee, and a shout out to Senator Kirkmeyer and her colleagues, I think we had the most investment in water infrastructure and water projects that we've ever had in a single year this year. Over $95 million got appropriated through the projects bill and the budget for the water plan and for water projects across the state. That's more than I've ever seen in my time in the legislature, and I'm sure probably the most, 25 million of which comes from sports betting revenue, thanks to Proposition DD from a few years ago. So we're doing the right things in Colorado. We are funding water at historic level. We are having these tough conversations, but we have to do more, frankly, because if we don't have water, we don't have an economy. We don't have the state that we love, the natural environment. So there's a lot more to do, but this session was pretty historic, I believe, for water, and I'm thankful for that.
And obviously, Senator Kirkmeyer, you're in a different water basin. They're all kind of intertwined at this point because of Trans Mountain diversions, but the South Platte has different, water issues than the Colorado River does. But I wonder, especially as someone who represents very agricultural, heavy ag focused part of the state, does the industry bear any responsibility in this discussion, and what can be done from the legislature's point of view to maybe give those folks a kick in the pants to use less or change, what they're growing, or is that even an appropriate pursuit in your eyes?
I probably wouldn't see that as an appropriate pursuit in my eyes. Water is a water right. People own water. I've owned water, for agricultural purposes. And, it's reused, and this is one area where I think probably Senator Roberts and I would really agree on. And I know when we were going through, even with Senate Bill 213, the land use bill, we both were sitting there saying, hey, wait a minute, we need to make sure that we're protecting not only the western slope waters, but that dry and by that's happening up in Weld County, in the agricultural industry as well. So I think this is one thing. I'm very thankful that we were able to get to a task force. I think you have to have agriculture at the table. You can't just expect or allow cities to continue this buy and dry operation that they're doing, and really truly impacting our state's economy in a lot of ways as well, because agriculture is still one of those main economies in our state that we need to be protecting. And Senator Roberts is correct. I think this is probably one of those years where we have added additional monies into taking care of water and trying to come up with these plans. Again, I'm in support of the task force. We were all in support of that task force. Let's start having some measured discussions. But he's right. On the Joint Budget Committee, we actually added an additional $12 million to help implement the Colorado Water Plan, which is really kind of a bottom-up approach. Each basin, each area of the state coming together and saying this is what needs to be done in our area. So I think that's extremely important, and that's been around for a while. There was a drought task force back during the Owens administration as well. So happy to see that we're picking up on that and moving that forward. We also, in the Joint Budget Committee, funded additional funds and positions in the Attorney General's office. And I think we all need to remember, and again, this is where I think, again, Senator Roberts and I agree, along with many of our colleagues, it's not just about the Colorado River. It's about the South Platte River, and it's also about the Republican River. And remember, we did have a bill late in the session that came through, I think it was 1220, that came through to also discuss, what's going on with the Republican River. So we need to be looking at everything going on in our state, whether it's California trying to basically take our water, or Nebraska, or other parts of the state, or other parts of the United States. And I think it's one thing where I think people maybe outside of the legislators outside of the Denver metro area will come together on and agree on and fight for strenuously for our entire state to make sure that we are protecting our water resources in the best way that we can.
All right. Well, we got about 6 minutes left before our next panel. I want to get through as many of these as possible. So we'll try and be quick on these. Senator Roberts, I'll start with you on this. The governor essentially said the other day that he's going to veto Senate Bill 256, which is your bill delaying the reintroduction of wolves until there's this federal study that comes through. I'm just hoping you can react to that decision, and if you're having conversations with the governor's office, maybe urging him not to do that.
Yeah, it would be incredibly disappointing if the governor were to veto Senate Bill 256, and I really hope that does not happen. Senate Bill 256 is essential for getting wolf reintroduction right. If we know that this is happening, a lot of my constituents are very unhappy about that reality, but nobody's denying that it's going to happen. The voters decided that they want to reintroduce wolves into Colorado, but we should do it correctly. No state has ever introduced wolves without a 10J rule. And that's what this bill does. It gives the CPW and the governor's administration the legal flexibility to wait until we get the 10J rule from the federal government, which we hope to have by December 15th, which would be ahead of their proposed reintroduction deadline. But just in case we don't, it's a federal process. It could get delayed. Those things do get delayed often. This allows them to just wait a month, maybe 2 months until the 10J is in place. Having a 10J in place is essential to protect ranchers and farmers who have to deal with the impacts of this on a daily basis. It's essential for CPW to effectively manage the species and protect the wolves we are reintroducing. And I think, just frankly, this would show such good faith to rural Colorado, to my constituents. I represent Jackson County, where the wolves already have come down from Wyoming and are killing cattle, and they're about to be reintroduced into the western part of my district. And this would show such good faith to the farmers and ranchers that have to deal with this on a daily basis, that we want to get wolf reintroduction correctly. We want to give you the tools to deal with this. So I really hope that Senate Bill 256 gets signed. It's common sense. It was supported by gigantic bipartisan majorities in both chambers from all parts of the state. Denver legislators voted for it. Rural legislators voted for it. Democrats voted for it. Republicans voted for it. I just really hope he does not veto that bill.
Senator Kirkmeyer, shifting over to you, you were very opposed to the Senate Bill 303, the property tax relief measure that's going to go before voters in November. There was a few Republican alternatives put forward, but what do you think the legislature should have done here? And again, hoping you can be brief. I know it's a complex subject, but I would like to get to some reader questions as well.
Well, I think what the legislature should have done is not what this 303 is doing, which essentially your property taxes are still going to increase. You're not going to see any really big, huge cut in them. They're going to still increase. And at the same time, 303 had another little hidden gem. I call it kind of this bait and switch. But it was basically, while you're voting for Proposition HH to get a decrease in your increase of property taxes, you also will be basically eliminating your Tabor refunds in perpetuity. So I think that's a problem. I think what the legislature should have done, and I think what we still have the opportunity to do, is we should be working with local governments to determine how we can develop, really how to start ratcheting down the assessment ratio in a way that works, doesn't have such huge swings. There are three parts to your property taxes, or to the property taxes that come in. It's the assessed value, which the legislature doesn't have control over. It's the mill levy, which the local governments have control over. And then it's the assessment ratio, which the legislature does have control over. That's the part that we should be affecting and looking at. We could have floated the assessment ratio and looked at it, gone back and said, look, here, working with local governments so that they don't feel this huge sting of a cut, and said, how do we start ratcheting this down to some degree, maybe float it down based on overall how much is coming into the state, or based on how much is coming into the state in property taxes. So I think there are things that the legislature could have done, but I think repealing Tabor is not going to do anything to reduce your property taxes. That is such a misnomer, and that's what Senate Bill 303 is all about to me. Because if we were truly going to reduce people's property taxes, the legislatures would have looked at the assessment ratio and ratcheted it down. Because, if Gallagher hadn't been repealed, the assessment rate would be down about 5.0, 5.2. Instead, we were taking it from, this is seriously what 303 does. It takes it from 6.765 to 6.7 for an assessment ratio. So your property taxes aren't going down, and don't vote for HH because you'll get rid of your Tabor refund.
To be fair, I do have to point out that Proposition HH, or whatever it's called on the ballot, wouldn't repeal Tabor. It would reduce Tabor refunds, the amount that you would get over time, and part of that has to do with future economic conditions and what the legislature does in terms of that money. And then additionally, people will still get Tabor refunds under Proposition HH. They just will be, again, smaller than they would have been.
Actually, to be fair, it increases the Tabor cap. It takes it from the REF C cap up to a new Proposition HH cap. And Legislative Council Services said over the next 10 years, that means $10 billion. So $10 billion of your Tabor refunds will be going into preserving government and growing government. Instead of in your pocket, it goes right back to government.
That's true. And some of that does depend on what inflation rates look like in future years, because the cap is determined by that. But inflation, I think the chart that you and I looked at it assumed a 2.5% inflation rate or so.
Sure, but remember Proposition HH, also the new cap has a compounded annually 1%. So it's compounding. It keeps growing. The cap keeps growing. And you have to get over in excess of that before you will see any Tabor refund. So for the next 10 years, the reality is you will probably not see a Tabor refund from 23-24 on if you vote for Proposition HH.
Let me ask one last question on that before we go back. Do you feel like Republicans are going to campaign heavily against Proposition HH? Is there talk of an organized way to stop that from passing?
I think Republicans will campaign heavily against it because, again, Tabor has passed several times essentially in this state. It started back in 1992, and then every time it's been put to the test on the ballot, they still keep voting for it. Even, wasn't that in 2020 was the last time that the population here still keeps voting for it. So, yeah, we're still going to get that message out because, again, I think it's just wrong. It was like a bait and switch. The whole thing that we heard in the press conference and even in the governor's state of the state is that we were going to have meaningful tax relief. Well, I don't think it's meaningful property tax relief if you're still going to have an increase in your property taxes. And the only way you're going to get to that is if you say, I'm going to forego my Tabor refunds for essentially the next 10 years. And then here's the other thing. The other thing that's in 303, if you vote for this, the legislature never has to come back to the voters to ask them about reducing or increasing that cap. They can go ahead and do it themselves.
Yeah, that is true. Interesting 10-year sunset on that a future legislature and future governor will decide.
So that would be essentially dismantling Tabor in my book.
Yeah. There will be a lot of time to parse that out. I'm looking forward to writing that story once I could have one night of sleep. All right, and Senator Roberts, I'll ask you a last question here just to kind of wrap things up. One of the things that you have an interesting perspective on, of course, is crime in courts as a former local prosecutor. And one of the things the legislature did in the final days that didn't get a lot of attention because it's complicated, frankly, but they disbanded CCJJ, this panel that for almost 2 decades suggested policy change on the criminal justice level to the legislature, supposed to kind of take politics out of the process. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. This was a decision made by Democrats in the House Judiciary Committee after it passed the House. Do you think that was a mistake? And the governor started talking about an executive order to kind of form a replacement. I wonder what you feel like that should look like.
Well, yeah, you did note that. So the Senate did pass the bill to reauthorize CCJJ. It moved it down to a 1-year review instead of the 8 years that the original bill proposed to continue it for that long. CCJJ is, I think, an important place where a diverse group of stakeholders have a place to go to hash out really tough issues. There have been a lot of bills that have become law over the last few years that happened because CCJJ worked on the issue and proposed the bill or the bill subject. Then it's up to the legislature to decide whether to pass those. I've voted for CCJJ proposals and I've voted against CCJJ proposals, and I think Senator Kirkmeyer is probably in the same boat. A lot of my colleagues are in the same boat. But to have a body that can convene prosecutors, law enforcement officers, criminal defense attorneys, public defenders, human services people, formerly incarcerated folks, community advocates, a broad spectrum of people that are so important to getting criminal justice policy right. If that doesn't exist in Colorado, I don't know how we're going to have as well-reasoned and well-stakeholded policy coming forward. Every individual legislator is under their right is going to propose things that, don't have the backing of that long stakeholder process. And so, it was the decision of the House Judiciary Committee and to not continue CCJJ. I disagree with that decision. I know many members on the committee had a variety of reasons, which are valid. But I think we need to have something in Colorado, and whether it's established by an executive order or a bill comes next legislative session to reestablish something or establish something new. I understand there were some issues with the way CCJJ operated, and those are valid, but we need to have that bipartisan, universal perspectives, forum for this important policy, or else we're going to start seeing bills at the legislature that could pass and become law that don't have the research and the support and the stakeholding done, and likely we'll be back fixing them again. So, it was an important forum. I hope something comes back so we can have that type of forum again in Colorado. We can't do ad hoc criminal justice policy. We need to do it in a well-supported, bipartisan and supported process from a variety of stakeholders.
Well, we'll have to leave it there because I got to introduce our House members. But I thank you guys so much for the conversation. Senator Kirkmeyer, I look forward to calling you and talking through the Tabor stuff. I'm very interested in it and need to do some of the math and the checking to look at exactly how that's all going to play out. So I look forward to those future conversations on it.
Hey, and thank you to the Colorado Sun for doing this and having us. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, thank you guys for always answering my questions and being open to the tough questions. I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so moving on to our House panel, the final panel of the night, and probably a good segue here since Representative Garcia was one of the House members who took that vote on the CCJJ, and I look forward to talking about that. And I know Representative Puglisi, the Assistant House Minority Leader, was very vocal on Senate Bill 303, the property tax initiative. Welcome to you both. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Representative Lorena Garcia is an Adams County Democrat, and Representative Rose Puglisi is a Colorado Springs Republican. You both just wrapped up your first year at the Capitol, though you both have long histories in politics. Garcia, you ran for Lorena, you ran for Representative Garcia, you ran for U.S. Senate back in 2020 and have been a longtime activist in Colorado. And Representative Puglisi used to be a Mesa County Commissioner, long history in local government in the state. Again, thank you both for joining us. Really appreciate it. Maybe a good segue here is just to start, Representative Garcia, with some of that discussion on the CCJJ. If you can talk a little bit about your decision to vote to disband the panel and what you hope the future looks like in terms of similar law enforcement or criminal justice, defense, recommendations and task forces that move through the legislature or help the legislature come up with proposals.
Sure, it's exciting. It's exciting to be here. Just want to first extend a hug. I would have prepared a haiku for the Assistant Minority Leader Puglisi, but I didn't have time. So, inside joke that now everyone knows. Anyway, CCJJ. I think, with all respect to Senator Roberts' comments, I think we have spent the last 20 years coming back and fixing policy that CCJJ has recommended and that has been passed through the legislature. And so I don't think that there will ever be an absence of having to correct, unintended consequences or mistakes from the past, no matter what party is in control of the legislature. That's just a constant. It's just a constant in our history. I don't believe that CCJJ was serving up to its purpose, which is why I voted to disband it. I voted to say we cannot authorize this. That does not mean that nothing should exist. What it means is that we need to engage in conversations across the aisle with people who are engaged in criminal justice, whether it's district attorneys or defense attorneys, victims, folks who have been incarcerated. Across the board, we need to have these conversations to figure out what is the right way to set something up that's going to truly present an objective view and an objective recommendations to the legislature on how do we address criminal justice issues.
Representative Puglisi, kind of shifting topics onto the property tax front. There was so much pushback from Republicans on Senate Bill 303. And I know there was one bill that was brought earlier in the session that would have addressed rising property tax rates. But what do you think should have been the middle ground that Democrats and Republicans could have found on this issue? What would you have liked to see be the solution?
Thank you, Jesse, and thank you for having us here. It's great to see my fellow representative from Adams County, so I appreciate seeing you tonight. So the property tax conversation is a really frustrating one for me personally, because from day one, when I started, Governor Polis and I had a conversation about how property tax was of interest to me. With my former local government background, Lisa Frizzell, who is a former assessor who's actually assessed properties, and then Senator Byron Pelton, who also had local government experience. And so we had 3 bills collectively that would address some of these issues around property tax. We brought them early. They were our early bills. And we started these conversations in January. And unlike some of the other legislation around land use, the governor's office did meet with us. Kerry Kennedy did meet with us, and we were consistently having conversations, but none of those conversations really developed into anything that transpired in 303. And I think that was incredibly frustrating to know that we have significant experience. I always say, just to make sure everybody understands, the state gets $0 from property tax, zero. Municipalities get $0 from property tax. It is local governments like your special districts, your school districts, and your county governments that depend on property tax in order to provide these services. And so knowing that you've got such invaluable expertise, I mean, Lisa Frizzell, even more than me, has over 20 years experience in the assessment field. Why wouldn't you utilize us and those experiences to craft better legislation? And then saving it till the very end of session, when these conversations had been happening for months, was incredibly frustrating. Republicans on the floor brought 18 amendments that could have made the bill better. All were rejected. And then we tried to bring one amendment on Monday night, and weren't even allowed to present that one. And so I think that from a process perspective, despite like where you think the policy should be, I just think from a process perspective, there was a lot of opportunities to do it right. And we weren't really given those opportunities to be at the table, not meaningfully. And I think that's just really frustrating to leave all that experience out of the conversation.
Just to be clear, I think this is a question that I wanted to ask Senator Kirkmeyer, and I probably will call her after this and talk to her about it. But do you think that the legislature had a role to backfill local governments if it was going to cut assessment rates, or should that have been something that happened regardless of who brought the bill? And then if it wasn't raising the Tabor cap to find that extra money, what cuts should have been made or things should have been set aside, do you think, to have that backfill?
So before we get to the backfill, because I think it ties in, what the bill that Lisa Frizzell brought forward was kind of adjusting some of those rates and kind of a freeze so that we could have some time to really develop some good policy around property tax. And then Senator Pelton and I had a task force that was going to be made up of representatives from local governments that are affected by property tax, but also outside organizations, all of the people who directly have knowledge, and bring all those people to the table to come up with a long-term and sustainable solution. Because what we've been doing is band-aiding. So when you band-aid, you have to do backfill. I personally don't love backfill. I think that there's maybe some other opportunities, but we can't do that because we haven't had the conversations about what the long-term and sustainable solution is. So you have no choice. The state has no choice but to backfill, but we could have done this in different ways. We could have reduced backfill. And again, Lisa Frizzell had a bill that spelled it out. We could have had more conversation if people didn't think that was the perfect way to do it. And then give time for this property tax task force to do its work, like real legitimate work, so that we could come up with that long-term and sustainable solution. And that's not what we got. And so it is a bit frustrating.
One of the reasons I wanted to have both you on tonight is because I really value your perspective as first-year lawmakers, and Representative Puglisi, I know we had you on at the pre-session event, and I guess Representative Garcia, I'll start with you for this question, but you have both watched the legislature for years from outside, or from maybe the witness table, as opposed to the folks who are behind the desks in the committees. I wonder how the experience met and didn't meet your expectations. What were some surprises, high parts, low parts? Any insights into how things work? One of the things we'd love to do with the Sun is kind of make this process more accessible to folks, and I'm just really interested, Representative Garcia, just to hear kind of your perspective on that. But you're still muted.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think this session in particular stands out. I mean, I think even just if you ask anyone else who isn't even serving, like the Lobby Corps activists, they'll say, what the actual heck happened? So I don't think that's I think it just is. And, but I don't actually think that's a bad thing necessarily, because, you have a party. I mean, I think we have to go, if we start big, right? We start with elections. The people voted a supermajority into the House. So we had 19 Republicans that had to battle against this supermajority and had to come to the legislature with their communities that elected them, saying, we are electing you to fight for us in this way. And we had the supermajority sitting in those chambers saying, we elected you to fight for us in this way. It was a clear, obviously, right? Let's put sound effects and everything. And so when it comes down to making things more accessible, I would say this legislative session was probably nearly 24 hours, 24/7. So no matter what time of day, what committee, someone could log in and be like, what's going on now? And listen. And at the same time, I think what makes it challenging, part of the Democratic Party, is recognizing that even in my district, there are individuals that let's just be real here. I wasn't elected. I have a troll on Twitter that continuously said the unelected representative, which is yeah, that's true, because I wasn't elected. That doesn't hurt. I'm not bruised by that. But I wasn't elected. I was appointed to the seat. I was selected by a vacancy committee to sit in the seat. And however, this district has continuously been a Democratic district. There are still Republicans in this seat and in this district that aren't necessarily brought into the conversations or like heard, because the majority of this district are Democrats. And I think that's what makes it challenging when you are an elected official, or in my case, an appointed official, of like, what perspective do I bring? And then also holding like your own personal values and your own personal beliefs. There were a couple of times, there's one vote in particular where my personal belief was like, I will never vote for this. But my constituency in my district was saying, you need to vote for this. And so I said, okay. And I think in those respects, it's when you have to balance the idea of who are you and what do you bring with you when you walk into that chamber and you sit behind that desk and you sit on that chair.
Do you mind sharing what vote that was? I'm curious.
Yeah, it was the bill that was brought by Representatives Byrd and Evans that basically increased the level of felony for car theft, no matter what, like at what situation or the reason or anything or value. I firmly believe that there should not be a value placed on a car because we don't know the value to the person whose car is being stolen. I do not believe that there should have been an increase in felony for it, because the reality is that so many of these car thefts, which has been largely ignored, are because we have such an unjust economic system. We have people who are unable to earn money in a legal way, so they turn to illegal ways to survive. And a lot of times that includes breaking into a car, stealing a car so they can sleep, so they can keep their stuff safe, so they can survive. And I think that we need to start, and I think going back to CCJJ, we need to start looking at our crime that exists in this society holistically, and not just, you did something wrong, now we're going to punish you. But why did you choose to do this thing wrong? And I think that's what's missing. And I would have voted no for it, but my district, while I was doing town halls for the vacancy, was very clear that this was something they wanted. And so against my personal values, which was hard, I said yes.
And so for folks who want to know more about that bill, it was in the list of 101 bills that we worked very hard to put together. So if you would like to sit there for 30 minutes and find out what the legislature did this year, you can head over to coloradosun.com and check out that. Representative Puglisi, can you talk a little bit about how this legislature kind of met your expectations or didn't, and some of the surprises? I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Absolutely. I think there were a lot of surprises, even for as long as I followed the legislature. But I want to start with the positive. I was very excited to hear that it was going to be me and Representative Garcia, because we did make friends on other sides of the aisle as we were getting to know our own caucuses. So I think we've got a lot of that experience because there are just so many of us that are new. And not necessarily, again, new to the legislature, or legislative process, but new to legislature itself. So I think, despite what it may have looked like on the outside, I would say developing more bipartisan relationships, but not just on legislation, but just with people, getting to know who you are, why you're here, what your values are. I think that's just important to do as a good human being. And so that part I really enjoyed. I got to meet a lot of great personalities, and regardless of where we are on policy, I think those relationships are important. And so that's something that I value from this experience. I think the biggest frustration is kind of what I've talked a little bit about. As a county commissioner, we would all come together, Democrats and Republicans, and we'd be on all sides of the political spectrum. And we would come around our issues and find solutions, even if we didn't all love those solutions. And I think that there was definitely a frustration, at least on my part. There would be times, there would be bills that would come forward, and I would say, hey, I have to implement this as a county attorney for a small rural county, and here are the challenges I'm going to face in doing that. And can we talk about that more? And it was a little bit harder to communicate hey, there's another way we could do this. And we can do this better or different if we all have that opportunity. And, every time I went to the well, and there's a lot of people who talk to the camera, right? They're talking directly to the people. I was never that person. I talked directly to my fellow members in the chamber, hoping that maybe there's something I said, some small nugget that would make them think, well, maybe we could do this differently. I think timing is also hard, right? So many bills going through. It's hard to digest all of that. And there's definitely a lot of times with kind of a specialized local government perspective that if you don't have that perspective, it might be hard to understand, why I'm saying what I'm saying. So I think the education piece is something that, at least at the very least, I don't necessarily love all the bills that came out. But I hope from an education piece that at least I was able to impart some of my knowledge, regardless of how people voted, on our chamber as a whole, collectively, my caucus and the majority. And I hope that they at least learn from me. And so I think that there's still a lot of opportunity, a lot of good, there are a lot of good people who are really there. We're all there, I think, with a love in our heart for our constituents. We just want to do the right thing. As the representative Garcia said, all of our constituencies send us there to do different things. And so trying to find what that balance is really important. I hope next legislative session we can really start working, though, on more of the balance, or at least hearing maybe some different perspectives in a different way.
And a quick kind of coda to this, just I want to get to some other topics. A reader question from good reader Elliot Wensler, my colleague. She was wondering if you guys can provide an example of something that was said either at the well or otherwise that maybe shifted your view on the topic, And Representative Puglisi, we can stay with you.
There's definitely Representative Vigil had reached out to me after I voted for one of her bills, and she was like, "I'm so surprised. I just expect Republicans to vote against, these all Democrat bills." And I was like, "Why? It was a good bill." And so I don't know that she necessarily said something, but there's definitely topics that some of us have been more engaged on. That one was, as I remember correctly, around geothermal. And I've been a huge proponent of geothermal for years. And if Republicans believe in an all of the above energy policy, then that's something that we should do. It was either geothermal or hydrogen, but these are things we should be exploring, and I support that. And regardless of whether it's a Democrat bill, if the idea is something I should be able to support because I think it's good for the greater Colorado, then I'm going to do that. And so I think it's important to really look at the policies sometimes.
Representative Garcia, anything that comes to mind for you?
I'm not sure, honestly. Like I can say I agree with the AML Puglisi. Like I don't know that there was anything at the well that was said. I think it's more like the conversations that you have that help sway you in a vote. I mean, I think if you look back at records, you'll see that like I wasn't a fealty Democrat voter. Like I was looking at the policy, I was looking at the impact, I was hearing conversations, and I made my vote in that perspective. And it wasn't just, this is a Democratic bill, so you got to vote yes. I mean, like a funny, like I think I chuckle every time I think about this bill. No disrespect to the sponsors, but the bill that gave even more rules on how to use a roundabout, I was like, you got to be kidding me. Like, I have to go through 2 roundabouts every time I leave my neighborhood. And I can imagine that everyone else has to, and have to add one more rule to figuring out how the heck do I get in here? Nah, I'm not voting for this. And it was a Democratic bill, So I think that there's things where it's like, we're elected as party representatives. That doesn't necessarily mean that we are like blinded by how things could impact our particular districts and our particular constituencies. So I think it's just more of those conversations with people that you have on the side, or, as you're like on a break or whatever.
Shifting gears a little bit, I'll stay with you, Representative Garcia. I wonder, you're one of the more progressive lawmakers in the Capitol, one of the more progressive Democrats, and how you kind of felt about this session. There was a lot of talk about some of the disappointments for Democrats. A lot of readers also wanted to know specifically about, the failure of the bill that would have banned assault weapons in Colorado, banned the sale and transfer of them. Possession would have been allowed. You were on the Judiciary Committee. You voted in favor of that proposal, which didn't make it out of the committee. I wonder if you could shed any light on what happened there, and just talk more broadly too about being a progressive lawmaker and how you viewed this session, since a lot of those big ticket kind of flashy bills didn't make it through.
I mean, and I guess, again, you nailed it right on the head. Progressives feel like we did not accomplish what we could have in this session. I think moderates are like, yeah, we did amazing. And Republicans are like, thank God the progressives didn't get as much as they wanted, like whatever it is, right? And I think, I think it goes back to the idea of calculation and the fact that the bill that was intended to reduce mass shootings was not introduced. It was delayed and delayed and delayed because of the perceived backlash that people would get if that bill was introduced at the same time that the rest of the gun safety policies were introduced. I mean, let's just be real here. There are rules in place, there are strategies in place. Our leadership on both sides of the aisle work these rules and these strategies in order to help their agendas move forward. That just is what it is. And in this case, the fear of doing something that could possibly result in any sort of backlash, and that doesn't mean necessarily that like Democrats would lose seats because they actually took a chance and had the guts to say we're going to ban assault weapons. What it meant was, what does this mean for legislators in blue seats that aren't necessarily in favor of gun regulation? And so I think that there's all these calculations that go into play. And I just tweeted, this is public information. I just tweeted today that the reason why 1230 failed was because the system worked.
In terms of just, what do you mean by that?
What I mean is that there is an exorbitant amount of power that committee chairs and that leadership hold to be able to push policy forward or to withhold policy. And I think, and I will say that that's the leadership that's in the power, that's in the party that holds the power, right? I don't think, and I would love to hear the Assistant Minority Leader Puglisi's perspective on this, because I don't think that they had that much power to be able to say what bills get introduced and what don't. But there's an insane amount of power in leadership to be able to say what bills get introduced, when they get assigned, and committee chairs get to decide when they're scheduled and not. And I think that there's a lot of those specific elements of power that exist that in my perspective can get in the way of actually being able to bring voices and perspectives from community and policies that are derived from community forward.
I wonder, just to kind of wrap this question up, so many of these bills I think are going to come back next year. Sponsors have said that they're going to bring them back. What do you do differently? What can you do differently to try and, whether it's work that system or work within the bounds of it, how do you move things forward?
That's the $1 million question, isn't it? Right? Because Representative Epps could bring 1230 back exactly in its form, and we could face the exact same fate. Someone else could bring it back who, I'm gonna be real here, go into race politics, who's not a Black woman, maybe a white straight man, and it might get advanced a little bit. Maybe someone might say, another legislator who says, you know what, we're gonna bring assault rifle ban, but it's only for new sales and that's it. So that's taking a significant concession from what the original 1230 was, and that might be more that might strike people's appetite a little bit more. So the question of, when you bring a bill back, are you going to bring it back in the same way? Because I have a couple of those. Like I have a couple where I'm just like, I need to make that calculation. Am I going to bring this bill back exactly the same way and say, ready, set, go, or no?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Especially, this was my sixth session, and I always am fascinated by the bills that get brought. The first year after an election year, and then the second year, and how that affects things. The ballot. Do voters have like a long memory? How much are they paying attention? It's always kind of fascinating to think about those things. Representative Puglisi, you're a member of leadership, the assistant minority leader. Obviously, you're not Democratic leadership, so you don't have quite as much power as, say, the speaker or the majority leader does. But I wonder, from your perspective, interesting thing we saw on the last day of session where Republicans walked out on the final vote on Senate Bill 303. Are you worried at all about how that sets things up for next year? You're looking probably at 3 more years, almost guaranteed, of Democratic majority at the Capitol. Are you concerned that it's going to, affect your relationship and your ability to kind of influence the process?
I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens next. I do think and truly believe that we were backed into a corner where we felt like we had no choice. To not be able to bring our own amendment, to not be able to speak, to be limited in such a way that we were so insignificant, it mattered to us. And we had to show that it mattered to us. We did a couple of votes where we did protest votes before we walked out. So it wasn't like we just got up and left. And it wasn't sending a message that like, hey, we need to be heard on this. And especially on 303, again, the fact that we had been talking about property tax, at least on our side, with the governor's office for months. It was brought at the very end of session and not the same form that we were hoping it would be. We had no real input on it. And then we brought amendments forward, but apparently none of our ideas were good enough. Is kind of hard, but understandable, right? We are the super minority. However, it doesn't mean that we don't have ideas that should be considered. And then, they were working on amendments, which are substantive. And had it not been the last day of session, they would never have been able to bring that amendment forward in the way that they did. And the amendment was substantial and required substantial conversation. And we weren't allowed to talk. That's hard, right? You don't have to agree with me, but at least have a conversation or at least listen to what I have to say. But because they had wasted the whole day waiting for these amendments to come that nobody had seen, now they're rushed for time because they had to get it to the Senate. Well, that's not a reason to silence us. And I think, we talk a lot about being part of this democracy where all voices should be heard regardless of whether you agree or not. And we wanted our voices heard. And it clearly we couldn't make it heard in any other way. And so for us, leaving was the only thing we could do to make a statement that this is wrong. And I truly believe that. I think that was our right to protest. And we did. We never left Capitol grounds. I want to be very clear about that. We sat outside until it started raining and then we went inside. But it wasn't like we shirked our responsibilities because as far as I'm concerned, protesting outside of the chamber was just as important, if not more important, than protesting in the chamber. And that's the way to make our voices heard. Now, what comes next, I don't know. We're not in power. Our seat numbers haven't changed. I hope to be able to disagree with you in 2 years that we don't gain some seats back, Jesse. But the reality is I'm concerned about, what next session looks like. I'm hoping to have, most of my bills were bipartisan and they were good bills. They helped children and workforce and public safety, and they were bipartisan. They were issues that we found common ground on. And so I do hope that we put some of that stuff aside and really focus on what's good for the people of Colorado. And even if we disagree on the policy, that we at least have the conversation. I think that both parties deserve that.
Thank you for that. And I will say that you may win seats back. It's just the majorities don't look like they're going to shift until before the 2026 election, looking at demographics of the districts. So I want to end on a positive note since we talked about some heavy stuff, and I'll give Representative Garcia the last word since she's in the majority. So Representative Puglisi, I wonder if you could just share quickly your favorite moment at the Capitol this year. Obviously, there's a lot of tough things that happen, but we also have a lot of fun. And I'm curious, if you can just share, what your favorite memory from the session was, just to end on a positive note here.
So I'm going to say this because one of my favorite representatives from Adams County is on the line with me. It's just the relationships that we build. Whether you have Representative Martinez playing his bass on the side, that was really fun. But Representative Garcia wrote me a haiku one day when I was having a really rough day just to lift my spirits. And she didn't have to do it, but she chose to. And that's the haiku joke that we have between us. I attempted one. It was, I think, pretty horrible, but it was my first attempt, in fairness. But again, it goes back to, we all start out in the chamber as human beings. And I think we've had some opportunities to get to know each other as human beings, which was my favorite part for sure.
And Representative Garcia?
I think I would say my favorite part, this is a little like egotistical, maybe a little bit narcissistic, but like my favorite part was like the first time that I went to the well and I said, Madam Speaker, it's pretty dope to serve with you. And she responded in the same way. Like to me, I was like, I'm setting a tone of how I'm presenting myself in this space. Like we have to be authentic. We have to be who we are. And to be able to have had that opportunity was fantastic. Outside of that, I think that there were so many hard moments, and there were those great moments, just like Assistant Majority Leader Puglisi mentioned, just being able to do those small humanistic things with each other and for each other, and just being able to be in a space as humans is pretty real. Even sometimes as humans, it can be hard because humans are flawed. But just being in that space where we can be fighting so hard for our policies, for what we believe, and yet still say, hey, thanks for sharing what you shared, or thanks for saying what you said, or we're going to disagree, and that's okay.
Yeah, there's often a lot of negative headlines that come out of the Capitol, but it's always fun to see people from different parts of the state and different backgrounds and different life experiences kind of all come together and have those interesting conversations. So I appreciate you both sharing that. Thank you very much, so much for joining us, and I really appreciate it. Great to hear from both of you. Super interesting. Love the perspective, and it's always fun to hear from lawmakers who knew the experience and kind of what you saw. Thank you to the folks behind the scenes tonight who made it possible, Christina Pritchett and Eric Lubritz and Elliot Wensler. Thank you to our previous panelists, the governor and the two senators. Thank you to our Colorado Sun members who made this possible. And thank you to Aponte and Busam, our sponsor for the evening. Really appreciate it. Hope to see you guys again soon. Love talking to you. I'm enjoying making lists here of things I want to pick your brains about after this call on this evening. Hope you have a restful summer and have a safe night. Hope nobody's getting hailed on this evening. And again, thank you for joining the Colorado Sun. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.